Thanks, Tina. Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Marshall. I'm the Director of Research at Oxford Measured and also a trustee of the SRA. I have the pleasure today of chairing what I am sure will be a fascinating and thought-provoking session on new challenges and practices and what they mean for ethics in social research. This session was put on in response to comments from SRA members and training attendees, so I'm sure there will be lots of thoughts and questions. Please do submit questions through the Hoover app, and again, we'll have a roving mic too. Also to note, both of our excellent speakers have drafted ethics guidance on the topics that they will be presenting on to complement the existing SRA guidance on research ethics. These will be emailed to members for consultation using the Member Hub. Attendees who are not members can also send their thoughts and comments to admin@the-sra.org.uk. You don't need to remember that because there are fuller explanations in the app. I don't want to take away time from our amazing speakers, so before I introduce them, all I will say is please allow yourself to be informed and perhaps even challenged by their presentations, and please do submit your questions in the app. So first we're going to hear from Holly. Holly Taylor-Dunn is an experienced social researcher who has worked with and researched with survivors of trauma for 25 years. Holly is currently working as a freelance consultant and is passionate about using her professional and lived experience of trauma to help others design safe and inclusive research. And she delivers excellent training on equity-based trauma-informed research through the SRA. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to see some familiar faces. It was slightly terrifying coming after Danny, but luckily there's lots of crossover between what he said and what I'll be saying as well. You will notice that on the presentation slide it says Holly and Skye. Unfortunately, Skye can't be here today. So, yeah, I'm not sure I'll forgive her for leaving me to talk in front of this many people. But, yeah, thank you, Skye. I've just realised I don't know how to move on to the next slide. But hopefully someone can... OK, do that for me. OK, so as well as... thank you. No, that's perfect. Yeah, lovely. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what equitable trauma-informed research ethics is and why it matters and how it challenges some of those traditional ethics systems, and that's definitely something that started to come out of what Danny was saying. Really, the purpose of today is to start a conversation with you about how we can build ethical processes that genuinely support researchers in all sectors to design research that is equitable and trauma-informed. And that comes from 2 years ago, Skye and I presented here at the SRA conference about what equitable trauma-informed research was. And following that, we developed a training course and we've delivered it to hundreds of researchers, both in the UK and internationally, in government departments, freelancers, and academics. And one of the key challenges that comes out is research ethics, that can be a barrier to doing this type of research. And I worked for 10 years in higher education. I've been involved in ethics for 10 years. I advise universities and the SRA and different government departments on research ethics. And I know myself that can be a barrier. So really what we want to do today is start that conversation. How can we equip all researchers in all sectors, because there are many researchers in this room and working out there in the community that don't have access to formal ethical oversight because they're not part of a university or they're not part of a government department. So what can we do to make sure that everybody can, do research in a safe and inclusive way? So to start the conversation, I'll explain what equity-based trauma-informed research is. I will, if that allows me to move. Oh, there we go. Right, sorry, you may notice that I end up skipping slides because it doesn't like my fingerprint. Sorry, I will get there. OK, so there are 6 principles to trauma-informed research. The first is safety. So this is around emotional safety, physical safety, but also cultural and relational safety. Thank you. Okay. The next is around trust and transparency. So taking time to build trust with communities, and that really feeds into what Danny was saying, that actually if we want to change policy, we need to build trust and we need to build relationships, and that can be unpredictable. The same goes in equitable trauma-informed research as well. Empowerment, voice and control. So we want participants to decide if, when and how they take part in research. And again, that feeds really into what Danny was saying, that the nature of how we do research needs to be different. And so we need to do things like changing the automatic assumption that we do our ethics process at the start of the research and we ask for consent at the start of the research, when start of an interview, for example. Well, actually, how can someone consent and give really informed consent if they've not even told you what they want to tell you? That doesn't happen until the end. We should be checking consent again at the end. There are simple little things that we can do to embed empowerment, voice and control throughout the research process. Collaboration. So research needs to be a shared decision-making process, and that really feeds into what Danny was saying, that actually we have to do this with communities. You are taught as you know, academics and researchers to, you know, identify your research questions and to see what the literature has to say. But actually we've got to take a step back and go to communities. What do you think is important? What is challenging for you at the moment? What do you need the research to look at? Crucial in this approach is cultural, historical and gender awareness. So the approach that we take to trauma-informed research is that we have to understand the context in which people are living, because trauma is not an individual problem. Trauma is a societal problem. Poverty, racism, discrimination, all of those are structural forms of trauma. They impact not only the individual, but they also impact the extent to which they can access the support that they need. And as researchers, we have to understand that. We have to know what communities are dealing with when we're going in and we're designing research and we're working in this way. And then the final principle is around peer support. So how do we embed lived experience throughout the research process, but also how can we create opportunities for people with lived experience to come together in the research process? So this brings us on to what some of the limits of traditional research ethics approaches are. So traditional research ethics, certainly in the UK and a lot of Western countries, were not designed for this way of working. They weren't designed for participatory, collaborative or trauma-related research. Traditional research ethics is very much rooted in biomedical approaches. So that's very much around risk-benefit calculations. Is the benefit of taking part outweighing the potential risk to you? It's very much a medical model. Traditional ethics assumes linearity, predictability and neutrality, something that Danny talked about as well. But all of that breaks down when we're doing research in an equitable, trauma-informed way. The focus on vulnerable participants silences the fact that actually there are structural forms of vulnerability, such as poverty and racism and discrimination, that we're not necessarily addressing. And traditionally, researcher wellbeing has been downplayed in traditional research ethics approaches. We see that changing. There's some fantastic work happening, and particularly the University of Bath have done a lot of work on this. But actually thinking about researcher wellbeing is a very recent development in terms of how we plan our research. And also, as I mentioned at the start, many researchers are operating without any formal ethical oversight. And that can be just as challenging as some of the more formal processes. So what does equitable trauma-informed research ethics look like? It's all about centering safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, cultural awareness and peer support, those 6 trauma-informed principles. It's about recognising structural inequity and power as core ethical concerns. So if you're an academic and you want to do research with your students, you have to go through so many processes because there is an inherent power differential there. But do we apply that same thought to actually the structural forms of inequality in communities, such as racism, such as people's experiences with the police or social services? And do we think about how we may replicate some of those dynamics in our research? Are we really thinking about it to the extent that we should be? It also treats ethics as a relational and an ongoing process, not the hurdle that you have to get through at the start of research, but it's something that should be embedded, and it should be a practice that we do throughout the process. And it ensures participants have voice, choice and control, protecting both participants but equally researchers. And so working in that way requires us to rethink some of our core ethical principles. So voluntary participation. As I just mentioned, are we really thinking about the extent of some of those structural power dynamics that may impact who takes part in our research? We know lots of our research that there are particular groups of people that we just don't get to speak to. That's often because we are not working in a way that will include those people. Their voices are just as important, but they don't take part in research, and there are lots of barriers to explain why that is. But are we doing enough to really think about that? Informed consent. How do we communicate information about our research? They are often very long, lengthy, wordy information sheets. Do we think anybody actually reads them? A little bit like terms and conditions. How accessible are we making this information? You know, can we create videos? Can we explain consent in a very different way to make sure that people actually understand it? Confidentiality and anonymity. Well, if we're working in a different way with communities and we're co-creating knowledge with them, as Danny was talking about, actually, what if they want to be credited for the research? What if they want to be named in that? We have to think about this in a different way. Avoidance of harm. Yes, completely agree we should avoid harm, but actually Sky and I say we should do more than that. Shouldn't we be aiming to do good? Not just through the output of our research, which we hope will do good, but through the process of our research. Can we create opportunities for connection within our research that actually benefit the people who are taking part in it? And neutrality. Should we be neutral observers? This is a bit of a grand epistemological debate to get into at this time on a Wednesday morning, but we would argue that actually that premise of researchers being neutral observers, when we're talking about trauma and inequality, that can be really damaging to researchers and feeds into this moral injury that actually we're witnessing something, but we're not allowed to show our concern or to feel that injustice. And this isn't new. Feminist researchers have been talking about this for decades, as have researchers in other areas. So what we want to see is a move towards a more inclusive ethical approach that moves away from this traditional approach of being very procedural and focused on compliance, where we're prioritising institutional risks, particularly in universities and in government departments. We assume neutrality, that should be the gold standard, this kind of scientific approach to social research, and it's often rigid and quite front-loaded. And what we want to see is this move to a relational approach that's focused on safety and dignity and empowerment, that prioritises both participant wellbeing and researcher wellbeing. As researchers, Sky and I explain when we do the training, you need to come at this from the perspective of how do you make the safest and most kind of comfortable space for your research participants. That's your primary goal, not your research question. We need to acknowledge power and structural inequality, and it needs to be iterative and flexible and responsive. So, what next? So we're looking to develop the guidance. So what we did yesterday was launch consultation. There's 5 questions. You don't need to answer all of them, just any that are relevant to you. We know there's some amazing practice happening out there in terms of research ethics, so we'd love to hear about that. We also know that there are challenges out there, and particularly for those working in different sectors. So please tell us about that. And from that, in the autumn, we're going to kind of come together and publish an addition to the ethics guidance that will look particularly at equitable trauma-informed research ethics and how to do this work well. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. I should have said at the start that I'm going to take questions for our speakers separately. So if you do have questions, please put your hand up for the mic or submit in the app, as you prefer. A couple of questions to start off, Holly, around the term trauma-informed research. First of all, do you think it's a positive development that we're hearing this phrase a lot? Perhaps in a lot of ITTs I've seen recently, it's used very frequently. Do you think that's a good thing? Someone else has said they agree with everything that you've said, but feel uncomfortable with that term trauma-informed, and shouldn't this apply to all research? And they refer to ethnographic organisations in particular speaking about working this way.
So great questions. So the first thing, yes, not a great thing in my opinion that everyone's talking about being trauma-informed, because it's very easy to say it, but it's very different to actually apply it in practice and to understand what that means. We have lots of, I do a lot of work in the police and with survivors of trauma and actually, people are talking about being in trauma-informed, but ultimately, if people within organisations do not feel psychologically safe, then they cannot be trauma-informed. So if you as researchers do not feel supported within your organisation, if you're dealing with vicarious trauma, it's very difficult for you to behave in a trauma-informed way in your research. So, yeah, just because we're talking about it all the time doesn't mean that it's happening or that people understand it. In relation to, should this apply to all research? Yes, it should. Absolutely. The training that Sky and I do is we say, you cannot know, none of us know what our research participants' lives and experiences have been. You could be doing a research project on the most mundane topic that could not be deemed sensitive, although, in my view, you can find sensitivity in most topics, but you can't know what their lived experience is, and so actually you have to design all research with a lens of trauma and equity, because we cannot know. Just because the research topic itself isn't sensitive doesn't mean that the people that we're researching with haven't experienced trauma. And similarly, that we don't know the lived experiences of the researchers that we're working with. And people will have lived experience of trauma and researching that topic as well. And that adds another complexity in. So yes, this is a lens, and we talk about this in the training, is a lens through which we should see all research, because we cannot know what people's lived experiences of trauma have been.
Thanks, Holly. Were there any questions for the roving mic? I think we've got time for one more question. Yeah?
My question is on the...
Okay, feel free to ask yourself.
Well, I was interested in the implications of your paper for research with young people who, in the conduct of research, will be described as powerful, probably life-changing, hormone-suppressing drugs.
Right, sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm sorry, I'll repeat it then. As we know, in terms of the trans debate, there are questions about prescribing very powerful hormone-suppressing drugs, which will have very long-term effects on people in terms of their biological development. To young people in the current proposed research papers. Now, there's a clear alternative, which is what is an alternative, there's an addition, which would normally come first, which would be to look at the several thousand people who, by the Tavistock Institute and others, were prescribed such drugs over the last 15 or more years, to research what impact it's had on their lives, rather than embarking on a new study prescribing very powerful drugs to about several hundred young people who would be too young in many ways to take informed, to give informed consent. Does that make it clearer for you?
Yes, thank you. I think it raises an important point in terms of the fact that we really need to think about how we are designing research in terms of looking at how we can do the least harm and produce the most benefit. And so I take the point that, the proposed randomised controlled trial, could potentially be putting young people at risk. And to what extent can they truly give informed consent if we cannot know what the long-term impacts of that have been? I agree that's a real ethical challenge that actually the research team need to consider and articulate from a trauma-informed perspective, you've got to look at both the potential risk to the participants of taking part in the trial, but the potential risk to them not taking part in the trial as well. And that's the challenge. And unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer to give you one way or the other on that, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Holly, and thank you for a really interesting presentation. Okay, we're now going to hear from Reema Patel. Reema is the founder and director of Elgon Social Research, an inclusive research, design and practice agency known for its deep expertise in inclusion, participation and futures thinking, particularly regarding emerging technology. Reema's forthcoming book on AI governance, called Accountable AI, makes the case for society's continued engagement with emerging technologies in the AI and data-driven age. She has worked with the SRA, as I mentioned, to develop guidance on using AI responsibly in social research, and will also be delivering a training on the same topic in September, which I'm sure will be in high demand. Thanks, Reema.
Thank you. I wanted to say a big thank you to the Social Research Association for inviting me back again after 2 years. It's a real pleasure to be here. Some of you may remember that my last session was about deliberative and participatory engagement. This time I'm talking about AI and AI governance. And one of the things I wanted to do was just to connect the two topics. So one of the reasons I became very interested in some of the things that Danny was talking about, participatory research, was because it felt to me incredibly important that we understood what people felt about emerging technology. And it felt to me very important that we understood how to engage people on emerging technology. Deliberative methods and participatory approaches were a really key way or an approach through which we could actually open up AI technologies so that we could better understand how people felt about, experienced them, and then ultimately the goal is very much to help shape the way they work so that they're in alignment with our needs, interests, and values. So I want to, obviously there's a kind of call from Tina and others for a bit of optimism, but that's the vision that we want to get to. And of course, there's a question here that I've got at the title of this talk, which is who's driving? Because if we're going to have people-centered research, we have to engage with this question of the fact that AI seems to be everywhere. And not necessarily in ways that we've negotiated or we've explored. And of course, we want to get to that place. And certainly we want to get to that place for social research and our profession as a whole. So there's a lot that we've got to do. As the great Alan Turing said, there's plenty to do here. Plenty to do just a short while ahead. And even more to do a long while ahead. So I think that that's important to bear in mind. When I'm thinking about someone like Alan Turing, he had a lot of foresight when he was working on these technologies. And one of the things that he really illustrated when he was talking about these technologies was the imitation game. So he was talking about something called the idea that computers would become intelligent when we saw that they would be able to resemble human cognition. And that's important for us to think about because that's what makes it different from other general purpose technologies or disruptive technology. And of course, there's a challenge for social researchers, which is where does the work of a social researcher start and where does the work of AI start and what is the connection, the relationship between those two things? Tina's already mentioned I'm going to be speaking about the draft guidelines, but first I wanted to sort of set the scene before I talk about the draft guidelines with reference to my book. So, there's always that moment, but the slides are moving, great. The first thing I would like to say is deep concern and ambivalence is held by members of the public when it comes to the use of AI in lots of different contexts and settings. And all the research I've done in the past and recently has illustrated that how people feel about AI is heavily influenced by use case and context. So it always depends. And so I'd like to invite you all to ask yourself how you feel about AI and the different use cases and contexts that you've encountered. Just have a brief moment, reflect on that. So a survey that was undertaken by the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Alan Turing Institute very recently illustrated that attitudes vary by application. People can see both the benefits and the risks. So there are benefits. People can see them, but they can also see risks. And there's a really interesting conversation about the disconnect sometimes between the narrative about AI and the risks. And the other thing that this survey, which was rerun, illustrated was that concern is actually rising. So if we think about a Gartner hype illustration cycle, innovation cycle, it's basically this cycle that basically says there's always a hype when you've got a technology, and then you've got a trough of disillusionment, and then things level out. It does feel a little bit like we are in the trough of disillusionment, and hopefully we're looking to level out. But no, that's where we want to get to, certainly. Now, I also want to say a little bit about the fact that social research is not just being influenced by the large language model technologies like GPT. We do need to look beyond the large language model and think about all the range of different ways in which AI is changing research. So I've got a table here that illustrates that one domain relates to natural language processing, chatbots, translators, AI moderators. That's a whole cluster of use cases. We've also got biometrics and computer vision, and these raise really challenging ethical problems for us. So image recognition, facial recognition, emotion recognition, eye tracking, thermal scanning, these technologies are being embedded in the way we think about social research. We also have the field of robotics, where we've got social robots and human-robot interaction, and that's being used increasingly to study reaction. We've got the field of predictive analytics, which actually emerged long before large language models really arrived on the scene, where we use data sets in order to forecast or anticipate things such as demand, financial patterns and trends, public health outbreak forecasting, and then more controversially, criminal justice forecasting. So how likely someone is to commit a crime and an offence and those sorts of things. Generative and creative AI. So lots of people talk about large language models such as GPT are generative and creative AI, but there are others that generate art, images, music, and that presents challenges for trust in media, trust in news, information, all of those sorts of questions and challenges. So we've got a whole other cluster of things to think about there. And then also, a lot of people, I think Danny was talking about this a little bit, the use of large-scale real-time and administrative data set that are being collected or shared. Think about something like Google Maps, a lot of information, a lot of data there. And that's being used to generate new insights and advanced research. So that's an overview of some of the ways in which we need to think about AI and how that's affecting our profession. And so just to build on that, I think the key point is when we're thinking about research ethics, we've got to shift the fundamental inquiry away from what does the AI do towards this question, which is about what structural code is the AI being asked to enforce. So, people talking about neutrality and power structures and power dynamics, but actually you've got really powerful tools here, and if we're not really thinking critically about the use of these powerful tools, we might be reinforcing problematic historic power dynamics. And I like to think about this through sort of three levels or layers, and I've been interested in all three. The first layer is about the data itself, so thinking really critically about what data the tool is being driven by. and thinking about where that data came from and how it was assembled and whether it's actually fit for purpose. So, we might have some missing data about some people that might skew the data set. We might have inaccurate data, or we might have subjective data. So, decisions that have been made 20 years ago about people's, likelihood of defaulting on a loan, for instance, that might be quite subjective. Data that is gathered without full engagement and active participation of vulnerable groups, or otherwise in coercive or manipulative ways. So a lot of the work that I did historically on facial recognition technology and biometric has very much looked at that. And then you've got the tool, the level of the AI tool, the use case itself. So if you think about that table I just introduced, if you kind of think about it at the layer of the tool itself, there are other questions here. So one is about how AI can be designed for and around a small elite group, and not everyone, and can be influenced by skewed investment or economic priorities. So who's actually paid for this tool? What priorities do they have, and how do they intend to actually gain a return from that tool? That's important to think about. Some design choices in AI do exclude some people by default, and some AI models can be discriminatory by design as a result. And also here we need to think about whether someone's actually likely to be wanting to use the tool itself. Now, the third category that we always need to think about is, of course, the real-world impact, the outcomes on people. So we're thinking about the data, we're thinking about the tool itself, and then we've also got to think about the fact that we need to understand how different communities will be impacted by these tools and these technologies, even when they've been developed. And we need to design ways to measure and understand that. And we also need to recognize that these impacts can be influenced by the inequalities in the data and the inequalities driven by the AI tools themselves. So, in a way, I think there's something really important about reinforcing that point about power dynamic and the structural code that the algorithm or the AI is asked to enforce. And this comes from my forthcoming book. I did use AI to make this diagram, I must say. So I don't think it's terrible all the time. So I have used AI to create this Rubik's Cube concept. What I'm inviting you all to do is sort of think about it as something that can be configured, especially in the context of social research. So it's more of an assemblage, and we have to act in relation to the Rubik's Cube. So there's an active role that we play, and we're not peering into a black box or a glass box or whatever mental model that you might have come across. We're actually actively invested in shaping this cube. And there are three faces to the cube. The first is very much about that data. So we are researchers, so data is, quite central to our work. We do collect data and work with that, so that's a critical place to start. And so that's not a neutral input, but it's a reflection of normative choices about what can be known, measured, and acted upon in social research. The second point is something called capital, which people might have heard of, but it's a chap called Bordeaux. I haven't, my French isn't that amazing, so I've probably not pronounced it that brilliantly, but he wrote about forms of power in society, and research itself is a form of power. Scientific, technical, cultural, and symbolic capital research is very much about that. And so, we hold a lot of power. This type of power. And so if we're not critical about the way we think about AI, we're at risk of shaping asymmetry of power between states, companies, and society. And then the other face of the cube is about, that we need to think about, is the settings, the context and the environments in which we are using and deploying AI. So here, the institutional settings, such as companies, some of you may work for them, I do, state bodies, technological bodies, so if you're designing and you're developing an AI tool, you're already in this field acting, and research institution. And these organizations and the field itself is structuring the rules, the incentives, and power relations of AI for social research, and also wider society. Great. So I spoke about remaining in relation to that cube, always thinking about how we're configuring this for our work, but also broader society. So I'm going to introduce something that I think quite important, is the concept of critical consciousness. So I'm coming back to this question of a role of, and the responsibility of a social researcher in shaping the use of AI for social research. And the main takeaway from this whole presentation is we have to be critically conscious. And there are 3 ways we can do that. This framework is from Purpose Lab. So firstly, we actually want to do something about inequalities of power. Secondly, so that's critical motivation. Secondly, we also need to become aware of how social arrangements and structures work. So this idea that there is always a social code being enforced is important. And then thirdly, we actually have to do something. So we have to bring in a critical analysis of social inequalities, and we have to be motivated to create social change. Danny spoke about that, and action to reduce societal inequality. So that brings me to why these guidelines are so important. Which is a great break. Thank you. But why are these guidelines so important? So what I want to sort of say is obviously this will be shared on the hub, but what we're introducing here are 4 key pillars. The challenge for us was, and I say us, my colleague Sam Gates is with us today, so it's myself and Sam that have authored the challenge for us was very much developing a framework that was structured enough to be usable, but flexible enough to keep pace with change, and that's actually really difficult. How do we get that balance right, which Holly was talking about? And actually, the more procedural we get, the less flexible we get, so that's important. So that's why we've got 4 foundational pillars. Because we've got all these use cases, and we've got to somehow apply them to all these use cases and concepts. It's actually quite hard to do that. The first one is around transparency and clarity regarding AI's use and purpose. So here we just, the most important thing is if you're not disclosing that you've used AI and you don't feel that you can disclose that you've used AI, you probably shouldn't be using it. We don't want to be in social research using AI and not sharing that. We've got to ask ourselves some questions about that. The second one links to what I was saying about critical consciousness. The AI being in the loop of social research, so not humans in the loop, AI in the loop. So critical oversight and treating AI as an assistant and never a replacement for your professional judgment. So retaining editorial control, applying critical thinking throughout the entire research lifestyle, from the data that's being gathered through to the final output. And the third relates to care for the well-being of participants, so really important, which is about who is this actually for? This is for people and society more broadly. Bringing in again here the do no harm principle. We want to ensure that all tools comply with robust data standards, but we also want to make sure that they're not actually harming people in community. And we want to ensure that throughout the 4th pillar, that we are maintaining and upholding research standards. So this is about critically assessing whether it actually is improving research. I think that's a really important question to ask, is why are we doing this? Is this actually going to improve the quality of what we're doing? So really focusing on quality, not on things like cost effectiveness or efficiencies and so on. I think that that's going to be central to the role of a social researcher going forward. There's a couple of rules of thumb that we set out in this draft guidance. One is around self-reflexivity. So we want you to answer this question. Am I confident that the use of this AI tool will improve the legitimacy, quality, and outcomes from social research for people in society in the short and in the long term? That's one rule of thumb. And then another rule of thumb is a kind of thought experiment, which is, if I told the impacted community what I was about to do, and then I asked them how they felt about it, what do I think they might say? Again, that's a good thought experiment to work with. And then what we also have in this 10-page guidance, which I've kind of rattled through very quickly, is a traffic light framework. So we're asking you to sort of think about these two things and then think about, how likely is it that, people say, thumbs up, great thing, go for it. And if you've got a green light, we suggest you proceed with caution, a second opinion, or independent professional review. If you've got an amber signal, you need to pause for reflection, seek more information, and implement necessary safeguards so you're not sure. And if you're a bit alarmed in general at that point, and there's a red stop sign, do not use the tool. So the guidance is out for consultation, and we've got a few key questions that relate to the guidance for consultation. I think that will be shared very shortly. So I won't go through all of that, but I'll be interested in your questions for discussion. And I also sort of say we've got a few things already on our website that might help you if you're interested. That includes a webinar on assuring equitable AI with the Social Research Association, a report on living well with data, framework and self-assessment workbook for public voices in AI. I thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you, Reema. A really important topic that I'm sure people will not mind waiting a couple more minutes for their coffee to ask some questions. I might just take a couple with lots of votes from the app in the interest of time. So the first question, Reema, you raised these problems around gaps in the data reinforcing inequalities, which is recognised as a really important problem. But what can we do about that? How can we democratise AI?
Yeah, so there's two things. One is democratizing AI and one is the gaps in the data. But with the gaps in the data, there are ways to basically look at the data. So there was that Living Well with Data report, and that's actually set out a whole framework for dimensions of data stewardship that we think about. So the first thing is to look at the data and to start asking yourself some questions. So where did it come from? How was it collected? Who's not represented here? Who might not be including their voices in this, and who might not want their data shared, and design methodologies and processes to enable that inclusion. And then with regards to democratizing AI, that's a completely separate piece, which is a much bigger piece. But essentially, I think that there's just something about enclosure models. So actually, at the moment, lots and lots of data is being collected and retained within kind of platforms that aren't really democratic in nature. So we've really got to resolve that problem before we do anything else. Once we have AI tools and technology that are much more open source, then we can have some conversations about the democratization of AI tools. But yeah, I'm conscious of time. So did you have another question?
Yeah, I'll give you one more, and I think it might be one that sparks a debate to continue through the coffee break. A challenge to your unusual use of the term generative creative AI. Does it imply, so the argument here is that creativity is a human term and implies intention and intelligence. Does that risk further misunderstandings?
So okay, yeah, it's an interesting question. So obviously what I'm not saying is that the AI itself is creative. So I don't think that's what we're looking at. And I mean, I mentioned Alan Turing himself earlier. And so Turing point is when does something pass the Turing test? Is when you have something that looks like it's creative, for instance. So it's not creative as such, it's just passed that Turing test. So people do call it generative creative AI, but yeah, I think I take that point. It may well not be creative in the sense of, a human designer creating something, unless, and this is where it gets really interesting, unless you think that if you think about the Rubik's Cube, I think there was a bit of a creativity there. I still have to prompt the Rubik's Cube design So there was a creativity moment. It wasn't the creativity of the AI, but it was the creativity of a researcher working with AI. So I'll leave you on that note. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for really interesting presentations. Thank you everyone for the great questions, and sorry we didn't get time to get to them all. I'm sure the conversations will continue. I think Holly and Reema have both emphasised iteration and reflexive decision making. There are no hard and fast rules when it comes to research ethics. So I would really encourage SRA members and conference attendees to use this space to have those conversations and iterate together. The consultations, I'm told, are live on the hub and are going live on Hoover in 1 minute. So please do provide your inputs, thoughts, feedbacks and questions. Coffee is upstairs in the Osler and Long Room, and the SRA staff with orange lanyards can point you to where you need to go. Thank you so much, everyone.